"Excuse me, gentlemen, could I play a song for you, just for a coin or two?" The tallest of the group erupted in cruel laughter. "Seriously, man? Are you for real?" His eyes swept Samuel from head to toe, taking in every detail of his disheveled appearance. The wrinkled clothes, the unkempt hair, the trembling hands clutching that battered guitar. "This is Music Row, not some cheap tourist trap." His companions joined in the laughter, a chorus of contempt that echoed down Nashville's bustling sidewalk. One of them, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than Samuel had seen in months, pulled out his phone and began filming. "Guys, this is pure gold for Instagram," he said, pointing the camera at the shabby man. "Look at this guy thinking he can just walk up to Platinum Studios and play for spare change." "Hey, Grandpa," another one mocked, "McDonald's is hiring down the street. How about trying something more at your level?" The words cut through Samuel like sharp blades, but he remained standing, holding the guitar as if it were his only anchor in a world that had become unrecognizable. His hands, those same hands that had once commanded entire orchestras, that had played piano for queens and presidents, trembled slightly as they found position on the worn frets. What those young executives didn't know, what their privileged perspectives could never comprehend, was that they were mocking a living legend. Samuel Croft wasn't just another street musician begging for coins. He was the man who had created the soundtrack for an entire generation, the ghost of music's golden age, standing there invisible in broad daylight. While they continued laughing and filming, Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and remembered when these same streets treated him like musical royalty, when his name in golden letters adorned the city's most prestigious studios, when a single phone call from him could transform an unknown artist into a global superstar. But today, nobody recognized him. Today, Samuel Croft was just another homeless man begging for change in a city that had built its fortune on the broken dreams of thousands of musicians. "Look at this," said the group's leader, still laughing. "He actually thinks he's going to play something. I bet he doesn't even know how to hold that guitar properly." "Keep filming when he starts butchering some song," encouraged another. "This is going to be hilarious." They had no idea that the beggar in front of them had written the song playing at that very moment on the radio in the Tesla parked behind them. They didn't know that those apparently trembling fingers had created more #1 hits than all of them combined would ever dream of producing. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 15 years of free fall, 15 years of pain that no amount of alcohol had been able to completely numb. His hands found the chords of a melody that had been born on a sunny spring morning, when the world still made sense, when he still had a family, when he was still— "Excuse me," he repeated, quieter this time, almost a whisper laden with a dignity that years on the streets hadn't been able to completely destroy. But they were already walking away, getting into their luxury cars, engines purring with expensive precision, taking with them their laughter and their cruel ignorance. And Samuel Croft stood alone on the sidewalk, holding a guitar that had once been worth millions, but today couldn't even earn him a single coin. I am the billionaire butler, and this is a story that should have remained buried in the archives of fame and fortune. What you've just witnessed was not simply the humiliation of a homeless man, but the systematic destruction of a legend that the music industry would prefer to forget. Tonight, I will tell you how Samuel Croft fell from the pinnacle of musical royalty to the depths of the streets, and how one moment of recognition would shake the very foundations of an industry built on image and illusion. The story begins not on that humbling Thursday afternoon in Nashville, but 15 years earlier, when Samuel Croft's name appeared in golden letters on Grammy statues and platinum plaques that lined the walls of his Beverly Hills mansion. Picture, if you will, the Hollywood Hills on a perfect spring evening in 2008. The annual Grammy after-party was in full swing at Samuel's estate, a sprawling testament to success that overlooked the glittering city below. A-list celebrities mingled on terraces, where Oscar-winning composers shared secrets with the world's biggest pop stars, who sang impromptu duets around his custom-built Steinway grand piano. Samuel Croft was the puppet master of popular music, the invisible hand that guided careers and crafted the soundtrack of American culture. His production company, Croft Creative, was responsible for launching the careers of artists who would go on to sell hundreds of millions of records. His Midas touch was legendary. If Samuel Croft believed in your music, success was virtually guaranteed. The mansion on Mulholland Drive was a temple to his achievements. Gold and platinum records covered entire walls like metallic wallpaper. Grammy Awards stood in custom-lit displays, each one representing a moment when the world had acknowledged his genius. The recording studio in his basement was equipped with technology that most professional facilities could only dream of affording. But the true treasures of his empire were not made of metal and glass. They were flesh and blood, laughter and love. His wife, Elena, had been a rising classical pianist when they met at a charity concert in New York. She had sacrificed her own concert career to support his dreams, becoming his creative partner and the anchor that kept him grounded amid the chaos of fame and fortune. Her laugh could fill their mansion with warmth, and her musical intuition was so refined that Samuel often said she could hear gold in a melody before he could even imagine it. Their daughter, Sophia, was 8 years old in 2008, a precocious child who had inherited her parents' musical gifts and her father's entrepreneurial spirit. She would sit in the studio for hours, watching Samuel work with wide-eyed fascination, asking questions that revealed an understanding of music that amazed everyone who met her. She had already written her first song, a simple melody about butterflies that Samuel had recorded and played for their friends, who insisted it was destined to be a hit. "Daddy," she would say, perched on his lap in the control room, "when I grow up, can we make music together forever?" And Samuel, wrapped in the intoxicating warmth of success and family, would kiss the top of her head and promise, "Princess, we're already making music together. Every day of your life is a song I want to produce." Life was not just good for Samuel Croft in those days, it was perfect. Achingly, impossibly perfect. The party that night in May 2008 was celebrating his latest triumph, a debut album he had produced for a teenage singer that had just hit #1 on the Billboard charts. The album was already being hailed as a masterpiece, a perfect fusion of commercial appeal and artistic integrity that only Samuel seemed capable of achieving. As midnight approached and the last guests finally departed, Samuel found himself alone with Eleanor and Sophia on the terrace, looking out over the city that had given them everything they could ever want. "Promise me something, Samuel," Eleanor whispered, her arms wrapped around both him and their daughter, as they watched the lights of Los Angeles twinkle below like earthbound stars. "Anything, my love," he replied, feeling the weight of gratitude and contentment settle over him like a warm blanket. "Promise me that no matter how big this all gets, we'll never forget what really matters." Samuel pulled them closer, breathing in the familiar scent of Elena's perfume and Sophia's strawberry shampoo. "And what really matters?" he asked, though he already knew the answer with every fiber of his being. "This," she said, her voice soft as silk. "This moment, this family, this love. Promise me that nothing will ever be more important than what we have right here." It was a promise he meant with every cell in his body. It was also a promise that would haunt him every single day for the rest of his life. 3 weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday evening in May, Samuel Croft's perfect world ended in the span of 30 horrific seconds. He had been working late in his home studio, putting the finishing touches on what he was convinced would be his next masterpiece. A haunting ballad that seemed to capture something essential about love and loss, though, at the time, he had no idea how prophetic that combination would prove to be. Elena and Sophia were returning from Sophia's piano lesson, driving the familiar route through the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills in Elena's Mercedes. It was a drive they had made hundreds of times. through neighborhoods where they knew every curve, every stop sign, every landmark. The other driver was a 23-year-old heir to a tech fortune, the son of a billionaire who had never heard the word no in his entire pampered existence. He was behind the wheel of a Ferrari, driving at twice the speed limit with a blood alcohol level that would have killed most people. He'd been drinking at an exclusive club in West Hollywood, celebrating a business deal that would make him even richer than his trust fund already had. The impact occurred at the intersection of Laurel Canyon and Mulholland Drive, a spot that Samuel would never be able to pass again without feeling his heart shatter all over again. The collision was so violent that both vehicles were rendered nearly unrecognizable, twisted sculptures of metal and glass that barely resembled the machines they had been moments before. Elena died instantly. The coroner would later tell Samuel that she had felt no pain, that it had been over so quickly she wouldn't have even known what was happening. It was meant to be a comfort, but Samuel found no solace in the idea that the love of his life had simply blinked out of existence like a candle in the wind. Sophia lingered for 3 hours in the hospital, long enough for Samuel to race through the rain-slicked streets of Los Angeles, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white, his foot pressed so hard on the accelerator that his car engine screamed in protest. He arrived at Cedars-Sinai to find his daughter connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision, her small body dwarfed by the hospital bed, her face pale but peaceful. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about internal injuries, about doing everything they could, about miracles and hope and the resilience of children. But Samuel knew. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they avoided making direct contact when they spoke to him. He could hear it in the spaces between their carefully chosen words. His little girl, his princess, his co-producer of imaginary symphonies, was dying. Sophia opened her eyes once during those 3 eternal hours. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through the noise of the machines and the bustle of the hospital staff like a blade through silk. "Don't stop making music, Daddy," she said, her small hand squeezing his with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't stop making music. The world needs your songs." It was the last thing she ever said. The drunk driver walked away from the wreckage with minor injuries. A few bruises, a mild concussion, nothing that wouldn't heal in a matter of weeks. His father's team of lawyers had him out of jail within hours, their briefcases full of legal strategies and their bank accounts deep enough to make inconvenient problems disappear. The settlement was handled quietly, efficiently, the way these things always are when enough money changes hands and enough powerful people have an interest in making scandal disappear. Justice, Samuel learned in those dark days, was just another commodity that could be bought and sold like platinum records and Grammy nominations. The funeral was a spectacle that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life, as a blur of faces and flowers and empty condolences. Every major figure in the music industry attended, their limousines forming a procession that stretched for blocks. Flowers arrived from around the world, from artists whose careers Samuel had launched, from executives whose companies he had made wealthy, from fans who had never met him but felt connected to the music he had helped create. But none of it mattered to the man standing at the graveside, watching them lower his entire world into the California earth. The speeches were eloquent, the music was beautiful, the tributes were heartfelt and genuine, and Samuel heard none of it, felt none of it, absorbed none of the love and sympathy that surrounded him like a cocoon. All he could hear was the echo of Sophia's last words, a promise that felt as impossible to keep as it was impossible to break. The weeks that followed were a haze of legal proceedings, financial arrangements, and well-meaning friends who couldn't understand that no amount of sympathy could fill the crater that had been blasted through Samuel's chest. He tried to return to work, tried to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of creating music, but every song sounded like a funeral dirge. Every melody reminded him of Sophia's laughter. Every harmony echoed Elena's voice calling his name. The first drink came 6 months after the funeral, Just one glass of wine to help him sleep, to quiet the voices in his head that whispered accusations and regrets in the dark hours before dawn. What if he had been with them that night? What if he had insisted they stay home? What if he had left the studio earlier, finished the song later, made different choices that might have changed everything? The wine helped for a little while. It blurred the sharp edges of his grief, made the photographs on the mantel a little less painful to look at. So he had another glass, and then whatever it took to make the pain stop, even if it was only for a few hours at a time. The decline was not dramatic at first. Samuel was still functional, still producing hits, still maintaining the facade of the successful executive who had simply experienced a terrible tragedy, but was bravely carrying on. But those who knew him best could see the changes, the way his hands shook during morning meetings, the way his famous attention to detail began to slip, the way his eyes lost their spark of creative fire. The music industry is not kind to weakness, not forgiving of human frailty. Success in that world requires an almost inhuman level of focus, of drive, of ruthless dedication to the bottom line. Samuel's grief, his drinking, his gradual withdrawal from the intricate social networks that kept the industry running, all of it was noticed, catalogued, filed away for future reference. The first major client left Croft Creative a year after the accident, then another and another. Artists who had once begged for his attention began taking meetings with his competitors. The phone calls became less frequent. The invitations to industry parties stopped coming. The trade publications that had once featured him on their covers began spelling his name wrong in small print at the bottom of articles about other producers. Samuel watched his empire crumble with a detachment that should have terrified him. The mansion on Mulholland Drive went first, sold to pay debts and legal fees that had accumulated like snow during the months when he couldn't bring himself to open his mail. The recording equipment was auctioned off to pay what remained of his staff. The gold and platinum records were packed away in storage units that he would eventually stop paying for, letting his life's work disappear into the anonymous maze of abandoned belongings that fills the warehouses of America. By 2012, Croft Creative was a name that existed only on old contracts and faded business cards. By 2015, Samuel Croft was living in a one-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood, paying rent with the dwindling proceeds from his music royalties and trying not to think about the life he had lost. The final blow came in 2018, when his former business partner, Marcus Reed, published a tell-all book about the golden age of music production. The book was titled The Hitmakers, and it dedicated exactly 3 paragraphs to Samuel Croft, describing him as a promising producer whose personal troubles ultimately made him unreliable and irrelevant to the modern music business. 3 paragraphs. 15 years of revolutionary work, hundreds of hit songs, countless careers launched and nurtured and shaped, all of it reduced to 3 paragraphs and a footnote about personal troubles. That night, Samuel drank everything he had in his apartment, and when that wasn't enough, he walked to the liquor store and bought more. When he woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, a social worker told him that he had been found unconscious in an alley, that he had no insurance, and that he had a choice to make about how he wanted to spend whatever was left of his life. He chose the streets. For the next 5 years, Samuel Croft disappeared entirely from the world he had once ruled. He became one of the invisible people, the ones who sleep in doorways and ask for change at traffic lights, the ones whose society has collectively agreed to pretend don't exist. He drifted from city to city, following the weather and the kindness of strangers. He learned which shelters served the best meals, which police officers would move you along gently, and which ones would do it with violence, which churches actually helped people, and which ones just preached at them. And through it all, he carried that battered guitar, the same instrument that Sophia had played when she was learning to read music, the same one that Elena had picked out for him as an anniversary gift in what felt like another lifetime. Sometimes, late at night when the streets were empty and the world was quiet, Samuel would find a place to sit and play. He would run his fingers over the familiar strings and remember what it felt like to create something beautiful, to pull melody and harmony out of the chaos of existence and shape it into something that could make people feel less alone. But he never played for money, never asked for coins or tips or donations. The music was too sacred for that, too connected to the people he had loved and lost, too much a part of who he had been before the world taught him that everything beautiful was also temporary. Until that Thursday afternoon in Nashville, when desperation finally overcame pride, and Samuel Croft asked strangers if he could play a song for a coin or two. The young executives had long since driven away in their luxury cars, leaving nothing behind but the echo of their laughter and the digital record of their cruelty. Samuel stood on the sidewalk for a long time after they left, feeling the weight of the guitar in his hands and the heavier weight of 15 years of accumulated loss pressing down on his shoulders. He was about to walk away, to find some other corner of the city where he could disappear back into invisibility, when a voice behind him said, "Excuse me, sir?" Samuel turned around slowly, expecting to see security guards or police officers, someone official who would tell him to move along, that his kind wasn't welcome in this part of town. Instead, he saw a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that marked her as someone on the lower rungs of the music industry ladder. Her clothes were designer, but last season's designer. Her makeup was perfect, but applied with the desperation of someone who couldn't afford to look anything less than flawless. She carried herself with the particular blend of confidence and terror that belonged to aspiring artists everywhere. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I couldn't help but overhear those guys being absolute jerks to you. That was completely unnecessary." Samuel looked at her more carefully, trying to read her intentions. In his years on the streets, he had learned to be wary of kindness from strangers, especially young, pretty strangers who might have their own hidden agendas. "It's all right," he said quietly. "I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," she replied with a flash of genuine anger. "Nobody should talk to another human being like that, regardless of circumstances." She paused, seemed to wrestle with some internal decision, then held out her hand. "I'm Madison Clark. I'm a singer-songwriter trying to make it in this town like everybody else." Samuel hesitated for a moment, then shook her hand. "Samuel." Madison's handshake was firm, professional, the kind of grip that suggested she had been taught the importance of first impressions and confident introductions. But her eyes were kind, and Samuel found himself remembering what it felt like to trust someone, if only for a moment. "Listen, Samuel," she said, "I know this might sound crazy, but would you mind playing something for me? Not for money," she added quickly, seeing him tense up. "Just, I don't know. I spend so much time in this city surrounded by people who think they know everything about music, and most of them have never actually sat down and just listened to someone play from the heart. It would be nice to hear something real for once." Samuel studied her face, looking for signs of mockery or hidden cruelty, the kind of elaborate setup that people sometimes use to humiliate the homeless for their own entertainment. But all he saw was genuine curiosity and what appeared to be honest kindness. "I'm not very good anymore," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Haven't played for people in a long time." "I bet you're better than you think," Madison said, settling down on a nearby bench and patting the space beside her. "Besides, I'm not exactly a demanding audience. I've heard every open mic night in this city. Trust me, the bar is not that high." Despite himself, Samuel almost smiled. There was something about her easy humor, her lack of pretension, that reminded him of Elena. Not in appearance. Madison was blonde where Elena had been dark, thin where Elena had been curvy, but in the way she seemed genuinely interested in people, genuinely willing to see past surfaces to whatever lay beneath. He sat down on the bench beside her, placing the guitar across his knees. His hands found the familiar positions almost automatically, muscle memory guiding him to a chord progression that had been one of Sophia's favorites. "This is something I wrote a long time ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for someone who meant everything to me." And then Samuel Croft began to play. The music that flowed from that battered guitar was nothing like what the cruel young executives had expected to hear. It was not the clumsy strumming of an amateur or the desperate performance of someone trying to earn spare change. It was art in its purest form, melody and harmony woven together with the kind of effortless skill that can only come from decades of practice and an understanding of music that goes deeper than technique or training. The song he chose was one he had written for Sophia on her 7th birthday, a gentle melody that told the story of a little girl who could talk to butterflies and convince them to carry her dreams to the stars. It was a song that had never been recorded, never been sold, never been performed for anyone except Elena and Sophia in the quiet moments of their family life. As he played, Samuel closed his eyes and let the music transport him back to those lost afternoons when the three of them would sit in the garden of the Mulholland Drive house, Elena reading a book while Sophia chased butterflies and Samuel worked out chord progressions on his guitar. The sun would be warm on their faces, the air would smell like jasmine and eucalyptus, and the world would be perfect and permanent and safe. Madison listened in absolute silence, her eyes wide with surprise and growing amazement. She had expected to hear the kind of music that homeless people usually played, simple folk songs, half-remembered pop tunes, the musical equivalent of busking. Instead, she was hearing something that belonged in concert halls, something that spoke directly to the part of her soul that had made her fall in love with music in the first place. The melody was achingly beautiful, filled with a complexity and emotional depth that most professional songwriters spent their entire careers trying to achieve. But more than that, it was played with a technical precision and artistic sensitivity that Madison had only heard from master musicians, the kind of artists who headlined major festivals and commanded six-figure performance fees. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound and respectful, the kind of quiet that follows truly exceptional art. Madison sat perfectly still, afraid to break the spell that Samuel's music had cast over the busy street corner. "My God," she whispered finally, her voice filled with awe. That was incredible. Where did you learn to play like that?" Samuel opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from a long journey to a distant place. For a moment he looked confused, as if he had forgotten where he was or who he was with. "I've been playing for a long time," he said simply. "A long time?" Madison repeated, incredulous. "Samuel, that wasn't just playing. That was professional level. That was concert hall quality. Who are you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Samuel looked at this young woman who had shown him kindness when he expected cruelty, who had listened to his music with genuine appreciation when the world had decided he was invisible, and found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected to reach. He could lie, give her some simple story about being a former music teacher or a retired session musician. He could deflect the question, change the subject, disappear back into the anonymity that had protected him for the past 5 years. He could remain Samuel the homeless man, Samuel the forgotten, Samuel the invisible, or he could tell her the truth. "My name is Samuel Croft," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of silence, "and I used to be someone who mattered in this industry." Madison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, stunned amazement. "Samuel Croft," she repeated slowly, as if testing the name on her tongue. "Samuel Croft, as in the producer, as in Croft Creative, as in the man who launched half the careers in modern pop music." Samuel nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. "But that's impossible," Madison said, though her voice suggested she was already beginning to believe it. "Samuel Croft he's legendary. He's like a ghost story in this town. People say he disappeared years ago, that nobody knows what happened to him." "Now you know what happened to him," Samuel said simply. Madison stared at him for a long moment, her mind clearly racing as she processed this revelation. Samuel could practically see her connecting the dots, the exceptional musical skill, the intimate knowledge of songcraft, the way he carried himself even in his diminished circumstances, with a dignity that suggested he had once commanded respect. "The executives who were just here," she said suddenly, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and irony. "Do they have any idea who they were talking to?" "No," Samuel replied, "and it's better that way." "Better?" Madison's voice rose with indignation. "Samuel, do you understand what this means? You're Samuel Croft. You're responsible for some of the most important music of the last 30 years. Those idiots were mocking a living legend." "That living legend died a long time ago," Samuel said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What you see now Madison was quiet just what's left, studying his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler, more understanding. "What happened to you?" she asked. "I mean, I know it's not my business, but how does someone go from being Samuel Croft to living on the streets?" Samuel looked at her, this young woman who reminded him of all the artists he had once worked with, all the dreams he had once helped bring to life. He thought about Elena and Sophia, about the promises he had made and broken, about the long journey from the penthouse to the pavement. "Life happened," he said finally. "Loss happened, and I wasn't strong enough to survive it intact." The conversation might have ended there, with a simple exchange of recognition and sympathy between two people whose paths had crossed by chance on a Nashville street corner. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Samuel Croft. As they sat talking, a black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of Platinum Studios. The vehicle was expensive, but not ostentatious, the kind of car that suggested serious money without the need to advertise it. From the passenger seat stepped a man in his 60s, impeccably dressed in a way that spoke of old money and established power. Madison recognized him immediately, and her intake of breath was sharp enough to make Samuel look in the same direction. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's Richard Blackstone." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat at the name. Richard Blackstone was more than just a music industry executive. He was a legend in his own right. A man who had built an empire spanning record labels, publishing companies, and talent agencies. More importantly, he had been Samuel's mentor in the early days, the man who had given him his first real chance in the business. He was also someone who would recognize Samuel Croft immediately, regardless of how much his appearance had changed. "I have to go," Samuel said, standing abruptly and preparing to flee. But it was too late. Blackstone had already spotted him, and the expression on the older man's face suggested that 15 years of absence had not dimmed his memory in the slightest. "Samuel," Blackstone called out, his voice carrying clearly across the busy street. "Samuel Croft, time seemed to slow. Is that really you?" As the two men looked at each other across the years and the distance that separated success from failure, power from powerlessness, past from present. Madison watched in fascination as she witnessed what felt like a moment of profound historical significance, the reunion of two titans of the music industry under circumstances that neither could have imagined. Samuel stood frozen, the guitar still in his hands, caught between the instinct to run and the impossibility of escape. After years of invisibility, he had been seen by perhaps the one person in Nashville who could truly understand both who he had been and what he had become. Blackstone crossed the street with purposeful strides, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. When he reached the bench where Samuel and Madison sat, he stopped and studied his former protégé with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile memory with reality. "My God, Samuel," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and wonder. "Where have you been all these years? We thought you were dead." The weight of that statement settled over the three of them like a heavy blanket. Samuel had indeed died, in every way that mattered, on that rainy night 15 years ago. What stood before Richard Blackstone now was something else entirely. A ghost, a remnant, a shadow of the man who had once been his greatest discovery. "I should be dead," Samuel replied, his voice barely audible. Some days I wish I was. Blackstone's expression softened with understanding and compassion that Samuel hadn't expected to see. In the ruthless world of music business, showing weakness was usually a death sentence. But Blackstone had always been different. A man who understood that behind every great artist was a human being capable of both transcendence and destruction. "What happened to you, son?" Blackstone asked, using the same paternal tone he had employed when Samuel was a young producer learning the ropes. "After Elena and Sophia." "You know about that?" Samuel interrupted, surprised. "Of course I know about that. The whole industry knew. We all waited for you to come back, to return to work, to let us help you through it. But you just disappeared." Samuel looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of 15 years of hard living. "I couldn't come back," he said simply. "Every song reminded me of them. Every studio session felt like betraying their memory. The music industry moved on, and I couldn't." "So you chose the streets instead?" Blackstone asked. Not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. "I didn't choose anything," Samuel replied. "I just stopped choosing altogether. And the streets are where people end up when they stop making choices." Madison had been listening to this exchange in fascination, but now she found her voice. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, standing and extending her hand, "I'm Madison Clark. I was just listening to Samuel play, and I have to tell you, he's still extraordinary. What I heard just now was some of the most beautiful music I've ever experienced." Blackstone shook her hand absently, his attention still focused on Samuel. "I'm sure it was," he said. "Samuel was always the most naturally gifted musician I ever worked with. Raw talent like his doesn't just disappear, no matter what circumstances might suggest." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision, then looked directly at Samuel with the intensity of a man about to make an offer that could change everything. "Samuel, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you give it to me." Samuel raised his eyes, meeting Blackstone's gaze for the first time since the older man had recognized him. "I'm launching a new project," Blackstone continued. "A boutique label focused on authentic, meaningful music. Not the manufactured pop that dominates the charts, but real artistry from real artists. I've been looking for the right person to head up the creative side, someone with the experience and the ear to recognize genuine talent when they hear it." The implication hung in the air between them, too large and too impossible for Samuel to fully grasp. "You're offering me a job?" he asked incredulously. "I'm offering you a chance to come home," Blackstone replied. "A chance to remember who you were before the world broke your heart. A chance to create music that matters again." Samuel felt something stirring in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It might have been hope, or it might have been terror. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. "Richard, look at me," he said, gesturing to his shabby clothes and unkempt appearance. "I've been living on the streets for 5 years. I'm a drunk who hasn't had a real conversation with another human being in months. What makes you think I could possibly—" "Because 20 minutes ago you played a song that made a complete stranger recognize your genius," Blackstone interrupted. "Because despite everything you've lost, everything you've been through, you still carry that guitar with you. Because the Samuel Croft I knew never gave up on music, even when music gave up on him." Madison found herself holding her breath as she watched Samuel process this offer. She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, between hope and despair, between the man he had been and the man he had become, between the possibility of redemption and the safety of continued failure. "What would I have to do?" Samuel asked finally, his voice so quiet that both Blackstone and Madison had to lean in to hear him. "Listen to music," Blackstone replied simply. "Meet with artists. Help them find their authentic voices. Do what you've always done best. Recognize the difference between noise and music, between performance and art. And if I can't, if I'm too broken, too damaged, too far gone, then we'll find out together," Blackstone said. "But Samuel, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've never met anyone who understood music the way you do. That gift doesn't just disappear because life gets hard." Samuel looked down at the guitar in his hands, the same instrument that had been his companion through the darkest years of his life. He thought about Sophia's last words, her plea for him not to stop making music. He thought about Elena's belief in his talent, her unwavering faith that he could create beauty even in the midst of chaos. And for the first time in 15 years, Samuel Croft allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to keep his promise to his daughter. "I'll need time," he said quietly. "Time to get clean. Time to remember how to be around people again. Time to figure out if there's anything left of the man I used to be." "Take all the time you need," Blackstone replied without hesitation. "When you're ready, call me. The offer will still be there." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully in Samuel's palm. "There's a treatment facility in Malibu called Serenity Shores. They specialize in helping creative professionals get their lives back on track. I'll make a call, ensure they have a place for you whenever you decide you're ready." Samuel stared at the card, feeling its weight like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you willing to do this for me after all these years?" Blackstone's smile was sad, but genuine. "Because 30 years ago, a young producer took a chance on an old executive who was ready to give up on the music business. That producer showed me that real art still mattered, that there was still room in this industry for authentic voices and meaningful songs. I owe my entire second act in this business to Samuel Croft's belief in music that comes from the heart." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He had forgotten that his influence had extended beyond the artists he had worked with directly, that his approach to music had inspired other industry professionals to maintain their integrity in a business that often rewarded compromise and commercialism. Madison, who had been watching this exchange with rapt attention, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Blackstone, if I may, Samuel played the most beautiful song for me just now, something he wrote himself. I think you should hear it." Blackstone looked at Samuel with raised eyebrows. "Would you mind? It's been a very long time since I heard new material from Samuel Croft." Samuel hesitated, his fingers finding the guitar strings almost unconsciously. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain the protective shell of anonymity he had built around himself. But another part, the part that had never quite died despite 15 years of neglect and self-destruction, yearned to share his music with someone who would truly understand its value. "It's not new," he said finally. "I wrote it for my daughter on her 7th birthday. It's never been recorded, never been performed for anyone except family," Blackstone finished gently. "The most honest music always is." Samuel closed his eyes and began to play the same song he had shared with Madison, but this time he sang the words as well. His voice was rough from years of abuse and neglect, but it carried an emotional authenticity that no amount of professional training could replicate. The song told the story of a little girl who could speak to butterflies, who believed that dreams were just wishes waiting for wings. It was a simple melody, but layered with harmonies and chord progressions that revealed Samuel's sophisticated understanding of musical architecture. Most importantly, it was suffused with love, a father's love for his daughter, captured in musical amber and preserved against all the forces that had tried to destroy it. When the last note faded away, Blackstone was wiping tears from his eyes unashamedly. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is why the music industry needs Samuel Croft to come home. Not for your reputation, not for your past successes, but for that, for music that carries the full weight of human experience and transforms it into something beautiful." Samuel felt something breaking open in his chest, some dam that had held back 15 years of accumulated grief and guilt and self-loathing. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to believe that Sophia might be proud of him, that Elena might forgive him, that the promise he had made to his dying daughter might still be possible to keep. "I'll go," he said simply, "to the treatment facility. I'll get clean, get help, try to become someone who's worthy of the chance you're offering." "You're already worthy," Blackstone replied firmly. The worthiness was never in question. The only question was whether you were ready to believe it yourself. As the three of them stood on that Nashville street corner, surrounded by the bustle of an industry that had forgotten Samuel Croft existed, something shifted in the cosmic balance of justice and redemption. The executives who had mocked a homeless man would never know that they had been in the presence of greatness. But Madison Clark would carry the memory of that afternoon for the rest of her career, a reminder that real artistry could be found in the most unexpected places. And Samuel Croft, for the first time in 15 years, began to believe that his story might not be over after all. 3 months later, Samuel stood in front of a mirror in his modest but comfortable apartment in West Hollywood, adjusting a tie that felt foreign around his neck after years of wearing whatever clothes he could find. His hair was cut and styled, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear with the kind of clarity that only comes from sobriety and renewed purpose. The treatment at Serenity Shores had been the hardest thing he had ever done, harder even than losing his family or surviving on the streets. It had required him to confront not just his addiction to alcohol, but his addiction to grief, his attachment to suffering, his belief that he deserved to be punished for surviving when Elena and Sophia had not. But with the help of counselors who specialized in trauma and creativity, he had begun to understand that healing was not a betrayal of his family's memory. In fact, the opposite was true. By destroying himself, he had been dishonoring everything they had meant to him, everything they had believed he could achieve. Today was his first day at Blackstone's new label, Authentic Records. The name had been chosen specifically to signal their commitment to real artistry over manufactured commercial success. And Samuel had been given complete creative control over the artists they would sign and develop. His office was small, but perfectly appointed, with a state-of-the-art sound system and a baby grand piano that Blackstone had personally selected from a vintage instrument dealer. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph, Elena and Sophia sitting in their old garden, both of them laughing at some joke that Samuel could no longer remember, but whose memory still brought him comfort instead of pain. His first appointment was scheduled for 10 o'clock. A young singer-songwriter named Madison Clark, who had submitted a demo tape that Blackstone insisted Samuel needed to hear. Samuel smiled at the irony as he prepared for the meeting, remembering the kind young woman who had shown him compassion on what had turned out to be the most important day of his life. When Madison walked into his office, her eyes went wide with surprise and delight. "Samuel! Oh my God, look at you!" she exclaimed, then caught herself and extended her hand professionally. "I mean, Mr. Croft, it's an honor to meet with you officially." "Just Samuel is fine," he replied, shaking her hand warmly. "After all, you were the first person to hear Samuel Croft make music again. That makes you part of my story now." As they sat down to discuss her music, her career goals, and the kind of artist she wanted to become, Samuel felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had defined his early years in the business. Madison's songs were honest and emotionally complex, with melodies that stayed with you long after the music stopped. She had the rare combination of commercial appeal and artistic integrity that Samuel had always looked for in the artists he chose to work with. "I want to ask you something," Samuel said, after they had listened to several of her demo recordings. "That day we met on the street, why did you stop to talk to me? Most people just walk past homeless individuals as if they don't exist." Madison considered the question carefully before answering. "My father was a session musician when I was growing up," she said finally. "Never quite made it big, but he was incredibly talented. He always told me that you never know where you might encounter greatness, that some of the most extraordinary artists are the ones who slip through the cracks of the industry. He taught me to listen to the music, not judge the messenger." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. He passed away 2 years ago, but I tried to live by his principles. When I heard you play that day, I knew I was hearing something special, even before I knew who you were." Samuel felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. In that moment, He understood that his journey from the penthouse to the pavement and back again had not been meaningless. It had taught him humility, compassion, and a deeper appreciation for the transformative power of music. "Let's make a record," he said simply. "Let's create something that honors your father's memory and your talent, something that proves authentic artistry still has a place in this industry." As they shook hands on their new partnership, Samuel thought about the executives who had mocked him on that Nashville street corner. They were probably still making the same formulaic music, still chasing trends and demographics, still measuring success only in terms of chart positions and profit margins. They would never understand that the homeless man they had ridiculed possessed something more valuable than all their connections and industry insights combined. He had the wisdom that comes from losing everything and finding the strength to rebuild, the authenticity that can only be earned through genuine suffering and hard-won redemption. The music industry had not lost Samuel Croft after all. It had simply misplaced him for a while, forgotten where to look for the kind of artistry that transcends commerce and touches the human soul. But now he was back, carrying with him the scars and wisdom of his journey, ready to prove that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken places, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Over the following months, Authentic Records became the most talked-about new label in the industry. Samuel's ear for talent proved as sharp as ever, and his approach to artist development focused on authenticity and emotional truth, rather than market research and focus group testing, began to attract attention from musicians who had grown tired of the industry's emphasis on manufactured personas and algorithmic hits. The label's first album, Madison Clark's debut Butterfly Dreams, went to number 3 on the Billboard charts and earned critical acclaim for its emotional honesty and musical sophistication. The title track, co-written by Samuel and Madison, was a reimagining of the song he had written for Sophia, transformed from a father's lullaby into a universal anthem about the persistence of hope in the face of loss. When the Grammy nominations were announced that year, Butterfly Dreams was nominated for Album of the Year, and Samuel received his first nomination in over 15 years for Producer of the Year. At the award ceremony, as Madison took the stage to accept the Grammy for Best New Artist, she dedicated the award to the man who taught me that the most beautiful music comes from the most honest places, and that greatness can be found in the most unexpected circumstances. Samuel watched from the audience, tears streaming down his face as he realized that he had finally kept his promise to Sophia. He had not stopped making music, and through his work with Madison and the other artists on Authentic Records, he was creating songs that would soundtrack the dreams and heartbreaks of a new generation. After the ceremony, as industry veterans lined up to congratulate him on his comeback, Samuel thought about the young executives who had mocked him outside Platinum Studios. They were probably watching the broadcast from some after-party, perhaps beginning to understand that they had been in the presence of a legend without recognizing it. But Samuel felt no anger toward them, no desire for revenge or vindication. They had played their role in his story perfectly, providing the humiliation and contrast necessary for his redemption to have meaning. In their cruelty, they had unknowingly been instruments of his salvation. Richard Blackstone appeared at his side, a glass of champagne in his hand and a satisfied smile on his face. "How does it feel to be back on top?" he asked. Samuel considered the question, looking around at the glittering crowd of industry professionals and celebrities, feeling the weight of the Grammy statue in his hands. "It feels like I never left," he said finally. "It just took me a while to find my way home." And in that moment, surrounded by the recognition and respect he had thought he would never experience again, Samuel Croft understood that his journey from the streets back to the summit of the music industry was not just a story of personal redemption. It was proof that talent, authenticity, and the human capacity for transformation are more powerful than any force the world can throw against them. It was evidence that the music industry, for all its flaws and superficiality, still had room for artists who valued truth over trends, substance over style, heart over hype. Most importantly, it was confirmation that the promise he had made to his dying daughter to never stop making music was a sacred covenant that could survive any tragedy, endure any hardship, and ultimately triumph over any obstacle. The homeless man who had begged for coins on a Nashville street corner was gone forever. In his place stood Samuel Croft, legendary producer, mentor to a new generation of authentic artists, and living proof that it is never too late to come home to who you were always meant to be. As the Grammy afterparty continued around him, Samuel stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace and looked up at the stars above Los Angeles. Somewhere among those lights, he imagined Elena and Sophia looking down at him with pride and love, finally able to forgive him for the years he had spent lost in the wilderness of his own making. "We kept our promise, Princess," he whispered to the night sky. "We never stopped making music." And in the gentle breeze that stirred the palm trees and carried the distant sound of celebration from inside the hotel, Samuel could have sworn he heard the echo of his daughter's laughter, blessing his return to the world of the living and welcoming him back to the family of artists who transform pain into beauty, loss into hope, and silence into song. This is the story the music industry would prefer you never heard. The tale of how their greatest forgotten legend was hiding in plain sight, dismissed by those who measure worth in dollars rather than dreams. Invisible to those who have forgotten that authentic greatness often comes disguised as ordinary humanity. Remember, when you encounter someone whose circumstances seem to diminish their worth, that you may be in the presence of a master whose greatest work is yet to be created. Remember that the distance from the penthouse to the pavement is shorter than you think, and the journey back is always possible for those who refuse to surrender their gifts to their circumstances. And remember most of all that the most beautiful music is born not from comfort and success, but from the courage to keep creating even when the world has stopped listening, to keep believing even when belief seems foolish, and to keep loving even when love has cost you everything you thought you couldn't live without. Samuel Croft learned that lesson the hardest way possible. But in learning it, he discovered that redemption is not just a beautiful story. It is the birthright of anyone brave enough to pick up the pieces of their shattered dreams and build something new from the fragments. The homeless man who asked for coins became the legend who created gold. And in a city built on illusions, that transformation stands as the most authentic story of all.